A common theme for this podcast is let's talk about things that I just don't know a ton about. And I like that actually because I think it puts me in the same seat that you're in. I'm not an economist, but I do care about my own personal finances. I care about the finances of the nonprofit that I'm in charge of and that I help run. And I do actually care about the financial situation in the country that I live in because I live in this country and it affects me and it affects you. And you're probably hearing people talk all the time on the news or on other podcasts. You're seeing a lot of activity on Twitter about the debt ceiling and what exactly the debt ceiling is and what it means. And both sides of the political aisle, the right and the left, they're using this issue the way they use every single issue. Every issue is the end of the world. Every issue is leveraged in order to get their way. Every issue is used as a chess piece on the board of getting their policy prescriptions pushed through. And right now, with the debt ceiling standoff, you have this situation where it's kind of like the government is holding each other hostage, trying to force negotiations. And so let's talk a little bit about this. This is like the idiot's guide to the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is a legislative limit on how much money the federal government may pay on the debt it already borrowed by borrowing more money. Now, if you think that I probably wrote that down wrong or that that is like the craziest definition of something you've ever heard, I didn't write it down wrong, and it is the craziest definition. Let's go a little slower. A legislative limit on how much money the federal government may pay on the debt that it already borrowed by borrowing more money. So, borrowing more money to put money on the debt it already borrowed. That's the limit of the debt ceiling. Um, and here's where things get crazy is the amount of debt that we're actually in as a country. And there's a lot of different schools of thought, different monetary theories. But here's kind of some cold hard facts. There's a lot of different debt trackers that are out there. This one I think is just the simplest to see. What is the national debt today? Well, it's 31 trillion, 461 billion, 68 million, 282, 315, 347, 380, 412,000, 445, 477,510. If you're watching this, it makes sense. If you're only listening on audio, I am not having a stroke. What's happening is that literally every second, the national debt is jumping by 30,000 or 50,000 or sometimes $150,000. And in the time that I pulled this up, we have risen almost another $1 million in our national debt, $1 million more dollars. And it shows on the infographic below that equals $94,184 for every single person in America, not just taxpayers, not just people in the workforce, almost $95,000, probably by the end of this year, $100,000 for every single individual in the United States. And that's where the money comes from. It comes from our taxes. It comes from the people to be used for the people. The problem is the money that comes from the people and our taxes, a very tiny percentage of it is actually going back to the people or for the good of the people. And the way that decisions are getting made is just so crude and so backwards in the way that our government functions. A lot of what ends up in the national spending every year are these deals that are cut from lobbyists who help put the politicians in their seat of power. And in return, the lobbyists then get guarantees for whoever they represent to get benefits from the national government. So I might give, if I'm a lobbyist, $100,000 in order to help you get your seat. But in return, in this kind of crony situation, you're going to make sure that I get $20 million or $200 million set aside for something I care about or for some break in what I'm involved in or something that's going to benefit me to the tune of millions of dollars because I gave 100 grand to help you get your seat in Congress or to help you get your seat in the executive branch. And so there is all of this backwards crony capitalism, big companies who come in And ultimately, the people who are meant to represent us as individuals end up representing first and foremost their constituencies and the lobbying groups that help put them in power. And so, man, we end up, I mean, I looked at some of the things that we have in our federal budget, and there was like $65 million for a research project on toilet seats. Toilet seats. Wow, that is quite the slip. Toilet seats that scan your anus, $65 million. So that's something that we're spending money on. There was a research at one of the Ivy League schools, millions of dollars in research grant so that they could leaf blow lizards out of trees. What are we doing? That's like something I would have done for free as a 9-year-old. We have all of this money going to all of these things. We have these entitlements, which, are going up dramatically and will continue to go up dramatically. And our debt is completely out of control. $31 trillion in our national debt. There's some other interesting infographics like this one that shows our debt over time. And if you see on the far left, like 1945, 1946, it had this big peak, right? And this is like right in the thick of World War II. And when wars and things like that happen, our national spending goes up, our national debt goes up. And then it comes back down to a pretty reasonable level through the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s. Right around 2008, 2007, all of a sudden there is an up and to the right meteoric rise where we're going as a percentage of GDP from 35% all the way to where we are right now at 98% GDP to debt. That means like the gross domestic product, everything that we bring in, not just the taxes. So here's what the government is doing. The government is putting together every single year. This is how the debt continues to increase. They're putting together a budget that they know they can't pay for. Okay. So this would be like if you make $4,000 a month and you sat down and made a budget that was $8,000 a month. Every month you're only getting paid $4,000. That's going to be your check. But instead, you put together an $8,000 budget and you just decide, I'm driving a brand new car anyway, and I'm going to eat out way more than I can afford to anyway. And I'm going to rent a house that is way outside my budget anyway. And I'm just going to spend $8,000 every month. And here's what asking to increase the debt limit is. Because remember, the debt ceiling limits how much money you can borrow to pay for money you already borrowed. So basically, it's like saying, hey, I've been living on $8,000 a month, even though I only make $4,000 a month. And now I want to take out more credit cards so that I can pay the debt that I already owe because I'm going in the hole every month as much as I'm bringing in. That's the situation that the government's in. And so keep that in mind when one side is saying we have to raise the debt ceiling. If we don't raise the debt ceiling, then it's evil and it'll stop all progress. Maybe you believe that, and maybe that's where you're at. And maybe you do think that the programs and entitlements are important enough to just continue exponentially raising our debt into the future. But you need to understand what they're asking for is not this like ambivalent thing. They're not in a position of power. They're in a position where our government has been run more ineffectively than any business that has ever existed. If you got put in the C-suite of wherever you work and you found out that your annual budget was budgeting double the amount of money that your company was taking in, you would sound the alarm or put your resume together to go work somewhere else. If you were dating someone and they handled their personal finances like this, like you found out that they were, making 50 grand a year and in $300,000 or $400,000 of debt, and they thought it was a good thing, and their answer to it was, "Oh, don't worry, I'm just going to borrow more money to pay for the money that I already borrowed, and I'm not going to increase any of the money coming in. And not only am I going to spend what I've been spending, I plan on spending more." If you were on a date with that person, you would run away so fast, you wouldn't even use the front door. There would just be like a cartoon shape of you in the side of the TGI Fridays where y'all were having that date. You would get the heck out of there because that person clearly is incompetent. They clearly don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to spend their money. So what's happening right now is on the right, they're saying we have to bring spending back down. We have to try to get spending out of control. They've passed a bill, and I'm sure there's things in it that people don't like, but basically it says we have to go back not to 1990 spending. Remember, where we were only at 35% debt to GDP, not 2010 spending, where we were billions and trillions of dollars less in debt. They just said we got to go back to 2022 and we're going to just increase it by 1% every year. And on the left, they're saying if we do that, we're going to jeopardize some of the things that we've promised the American people. And so it's worth noting that both sides have valid concerns. The question is, what do we do about this and how can we find a compromise? And because they have this face off and are leveraging against each other, what they're risking is defaulting on our debt. And if we were to default on our debt, it could have really serious consequences. And the politicians aren't going to pay those consequences. And ultimately, the big businesses and the lobbyists aren't really going to pay those consequences. It's going to be the everyday average person that's going to pay those consequences. It reminds me of another standoff. It's not actually related. It just reminds me of the writers' strike that's going on in Hollywood right now, because streaming has changed things, and now artificial intelligence is changing things, and the writers are being compensated so poorly that they're now on strike. And so the late shows are shutting down. A lot of development on Netflix and Disney shows is going to be delayed because production's been shut down because the writers have walked off. They're on strike. They're demanding more equitable pay, whatever you think about that. Here's what gets lost. It's like, who's really getting hurt there? Because usually the smallest guy gets hurt the worst. And what you don't realize about a writer's strike is that the people who don't have any leverage in the situation and who lose their job instantly and who don't have any say in it are the people like the makeup artists and the craft service caterers and the boom mic operators. Hold the mic so you can hear what's going on in your favorite sitcom when the people are talking. Those people aren't in the WGA Writers Guild. They're not represented by the big industry people. They're not on either side of it, but they're getting screwed all the same. And so, it's like, who gets hurt by all this? Well, us, the average everyday Americans, people who are depending on retirement, people who are depending on their health benefits, people who work for the government and aren't in politics necessarily, like potentially the people in the armed forces. And scripture has a lot to say about this. Psalm 37:21 says, the wicked borrow and do not repay, but the righteous give generously. The wicked borrow and do not repay. And remember, what they're asking to do with the debt ceiling is not to repay. They're asking to borrow money to pay for borrowed money, not to actually get their house in order and then pay things off and square things up. Proverbs 22 says, the rich rule over the poor and the borrower is slave to the lender. Well, that begs the question, who are we borrowing from exactly? And something you might be interested to know is that foreign countries hold $7.3 trillion of total U.S. debt. About 50 to 60% of that is held by the actual governments of foreign countries, Japan being the biggest, China being the second biggest. And so remember, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. We have put ourselves in position nationally where we are enslaved because people hold our debt outside of us, some of those people who may not have our best interest in mind. And Jesus said in Luke chapter 14, suppose one of you wants to build a tower, won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? And like, everybody knows this, but if you're going to set spending, you got to put a budget together. This is just like life 101. And if you're going to be in charge of the entire country, you got to put a budget together based on the amount of money that you have access to. And the way that we're using the treasury and the way that we're borrowing and selling our bonds, it is almost like becoming this giant scheme. And the government isn't supposed to run like a Ponzi scheme. It's not supposed to run like Bernie Madoff. It's supposed to run effectively, and it's supposed to run in a non-corrupt fashion. And I know that's like, that ship has sailed, and that's kind of idealistically, but that is your idiot's guide to the debt ceiling, because certainly that's about as deep as I'm capable of going. People probably have some great points about all the things I'm wrong about on this and how I'm seeing it backwards. But the bottom line is our debt is growing. It's growing every single second. And someday the bill does come due. That's just how it works. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender.